So far, we've discussed the three major approaches that the US, the Europeans, and the Israelis have taken to dissuade Iran from advancing down the nuclear path. There's been coercive diplomacy, creating and enforcing sanctions that were designed to force Iran to come to the negotiating table in hopes that ultimately there'd be a diplomatic deal. There's been the setting of red lines, what we just discussed, the creation of a point beyond which Iran could not go without confronting at least the implicit threat of military action. And there are other approaches that American and Israeli officials have taken, but that they've never talked about, at least in public, and that have been quite central to the effort to stop the Iranians from getting a weapon. And the chief method is as old as war itself. It's sabotage.
Well, sabotage is just one form of covert action that has a very long history, not only through the Cold War, when the U.S. and the Soviet Union were attempting to sabotage each other in every way from Sunday, but even in the early days of the Iranian nuclear program. For example, there have been instances and cases which the U.S. and the Europeans and the Israelis have managed ways to slip bad designs to Iranian engineers so that a component was missing. A bomb design at one point was evidently given to some Iranian scientists that was missing a couple of key steps, and when they tried it out, it didn't work very well. Indeed, if Iranian scientists had followed that particular blueprint, they might either have had a dud or even perhaps an explosion. So there's also been, over the years, a number of other activities that are kind of, quote, inexplicable, or in any case, seem a little mysterious.
Well, that's right, Graham. And, a key to covert action is that after you've seen the effects, you're still not quite sure what caused it. So in November of 2011, for example, there was a huge explosion at one of Iran's major missile sites. It killed one of the founders of the country's missile program as he was sitting in his office. Now, to this day, no one has quite figured out whether that was the result of an Iranian error, and certainly we've had many moments in the history of our own missile program where things have blown up when they shouldn't have, or whether this was sabotage. And then late in 2014, there was another mysterious explosion, this one at Parchin, which is a major military base outside of Tehran. Again, many people don't know what to make of it. Was it sabotage or a plain old mistake?
And it's been even more than things blowing up in the night. I mean, several Iranian scientists have been killed on their way to work. Most of those attacks have been attributed to the Israelis, and the Israelis don't acknowledge it, but they are in that business. American officials have certainly gone out of their way to declare that the U.S. does not engage in attempted assassination of scientists or others. So all these efforts have had some impact in slowing some elements of the Iranian program, but they certainly have failed to stop it. And if you go back to that staircase that we looked at before, the Iranians have been moving steadily up it. Or if you look at that trend line, it stayed pretty steady.
So what are the different types of covert action?
Well, that's a good question. There's a whole array of actions. Most are simply attempts to deceive, say giving the adversary the wrong target or misinformation. Classic example of that was the efforts to fool Nazi Germany in 1944 into thinking that the D-Day landing would be along a different stretch of the coast in France.
Well, let's think about covert action for a moment in the context of Iran. And there was one very secret project that I wrote about for the Times after the results of this operation became pretty public because of an error that had been made as the covert action was carried out. The program was called Olympic Games. Now, that's not the winter and summer games that you see on TV. It was actually a code word. Olympic Games had its origins in the Bush White House. And after the failure to find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, President Bush had known that he couldn't publicly accuse Iran of having a nuclear program. People would say, yeah, just like Saddam Hussein's nuclear program. But he also could not threaten military action against Iran because the U.S. was tied up in two different wars, Iraq and Afghanistan. Getting involved in a third at the same time seemed unimaginable. So he said to his staff, I need to find another way, a much more subtle way, a non-military way to slow the Iranians down.
So were they able to present President Bush with a new option?
Well, President Bush made it clear to Condoleezza Rice, his national security advisor, and then his Secretary of State, that whatever option they came up with, it needed to buy some time. He wanted to see if the time could be used to come up with a negotiated solution that would end the prospect that Iran would ultimately build a weapon or perhaps wait for regime change in Iran.
But how do you get that time, David?
Well, it's not easy, Graham, but the answer that was proposed to him came from a group of military and intelligence officials who showed up in the Oval Office one day, and they had a kind of wild suggestion, a kind of far-out plan. How about a computer worm, they said, that would be inserted into the computer systems inside the Natanz enrichment site. That's the biggest enrichment site in Iran. And that would subtly and slowly take control of the computers that run the centrifuges that are producing uranium. Now, you've seen centrifuges. They're these big floor-to-ceiling devices that spin at supersonic speeds.
What happens when the centrifuges start spinning and become unstable?
Well, the American experts knew that whenever a centrifuge becomes unstable, it begins to act like a top that's losing its momentum. And eventually, it can spin out of control. And when it spins out of control, those big silvery containers literally blow up. So the idea that was brought to President Bush was, in effect, to get the computer worm into the system, have the program watch the computers that control the centrifuges, and then at some odd, seeming random moment, it would take over the system without alerting the Iranian engineers who were running the plant. The program would speed the centrifuges up or slow them down until the centrifuges became unstable, and then they'd blow up.
Now, did any senior folks in the administration think that this plan was going to work?
Well, they thought it was worth trying. But of course, President Bush was kind of a show-me kind of guy. So he said he had his doubts this would really work. But he authorized his officials to go off and build what was essentially a replica of the Natanz plant at several of the U.S. laboratories. And together with an Israeli cyber unit called Unit 8200, that's the Israeli equivalent of the National Security Agency, the officials began to write code and test it against a group of centrifuges that were set up to look just like the Iranian plant. And sooner or later, they perfected the system so the centrifuges did become unstable. And in fact, they made some blow up. And when it did, they gathered up all the shards, put them on an airplane, brought them to the White House, and dumped them out on the conference room table down in the Situation Room. And that's when the program got approved.
So the question is whether they were more effective in blowing up their own model than in actually acting against Iran.
Well, it's a good question, Graham. Well, the program as it was used against the Iranian facilities worked pretty well at first. A number of the centrifuges blew up. The Iranians had no idea what was going on. They thought maybe they'd made some installation mistakes or they'd gotten bad supplies. President Obama got briefed on the program in late 2008 as he was preparing to take over as president. And in 2009, he began to ask some of his aides some pretty uncomfortable questions about it. He said, look, this is great if it slows down the Iranian program. But remember, what's the country in the world that is most vulnerable to cyber attack? It's us. It's the United States. So he began to ask, is the U.S. beginning to legitimize the use of these cyber weapons? Because he knew you can't keep a secret like this for too long.
So I guess the question was answered.
Well, Esther, the question was answered, but I'm not sure it was answered that satisfactorily, because in the summer of 2010, the secret did get out. The worm somehow escaped from Iran, and it began to show up all over the world. And so the director of the CIA and several of his aides had to go down into the Situation Room and ask President Obama, so what do we do? Do we shut this whole program down, or do we keep it going?
What was the moral of the story?
Well, the moral of the story to President Obama was we've headed down a new and dangerous road. Now, he told them to keep the program going because he said he figured the Iranians hadn't quite determined what was going on yet. But he knew that the damage that was done wouldn't last for terribly long. And in fact, the Iranians eventually recovered. But what's happened in the long range? You know, what's the real answer to your question? And I think the answer to it, Esther, is we've now seen an entirely new form of covert action come along. This was the first use by a state of a really sophisticated cyber weapon against another state.
How do you balance between the risks of and opportunities of just slowing down the Iranian nuclear program? I mean, yes, we've slowed them down a little bit, but the Iranians have already recovered, and now, you know, this worm is out there, Stuxnet, and others will soon have this capability.
Well, many of them, Esther, do have the capability now, and I think it's fair to say we've opened up a pretty big can of worms. Now, it may have opened anyway. I don't think anybody had imagined in the White House that this whole computer virus would get out and get replicated to other countries, and that it would give people access to a new cyber weapon. It's a concern for many in the intelligence community because having the cyber weapon out there is a little bit like having loose ammunition out on the ground for anybody to pick up. So while the Stuxnet virus infected many computers, it was specifically designed not to do any damage unless you were connecting those computers to centrifuges. But still, the fact that the U.S. made use of such a weapon could be used as a pretext by other countries to do the same. You know, the U.S. frequently lectures the Chinese on not attacking American companies, not only with worms that would do sabotage, but programs that would conduct industrial espionage. You've heard the Chinese and other countries say, well, how does this differ from what the U.S. has done to Iran? So I think there's certainly a long-term cost, and I think that cost is probably only now becoming evident as the U.S. tries to get countries around the world to agree to some kind of standards that will limit the use of cyber weapons.
Well, I'm a little more conflicted. I think there's a dilemma here, but the dilemma is really not any different than the one the U.S. faced in acquiring nuclear weapons. Since if we have weapons, other states say, well, why are nuclear weapons good for you, but not good for me? Or indeed, how is it different from the U.S. deciding to attack Saddam Hussein or attack targets in Yemen or Pakistan or Somalia with drones or special forces? Anybody else could say, well, if you can do it, what about us? So all of these questions, I think, remind us how hard the president's job really is. Just like Kennedy in the Cuban Missile Crisis, presidents face very unattractive options. In this case, let Iran get a bomb or bomb them if you're not able to negotiate an agreement. The president's looking for a third path, as Kennedy found in the Cuban Missile Crisis, but this is a hard search.
Well, Graham, it's a fascinating and difficult question. And there's another aspect of it, and it's one that I get asked a lot as a reporter, which is it really the responsibility of the press to keep the public informed about the use of such weapons, even if it's a classified program?
Well, that's a very good question, because if we look at the president's problem before you and your colleagues begin making it more difficult, then to have a public discussion of it at the same time is pretty hard. And I think, David, you're right to start with the question, what public interest, what national interest is served by making public this family of things called Olympic Games, as you treated them in your book, as opposed to leaving them secret?
Now, how in a newsroom do you actually make those decisions? How do you weigh those competing values and concerns?
You know, Henry, there's nothing easy about this, and it's not really a science. It's more experience and a little bit of an art form. But it's something we take pretty seriously, because you don't want to publish national security information that could simply do great harm without there being a greater purpose to it. But you have to also remember that if it was up to the government to make every one of these decisions, absolutely nothing would be published. And of course, we know that just because something is classified doesn't necessarily mean it would be harmful to publish. There's so much information that's classified every year that when a lot of it comes out, you frequently discover that many of the documents are innocuous, and many of them are on subjects you could simply Google. So we'll talk about that at greater length later in the course. But to answer your question, Henry, we have some pretty established standards that we use about publishing sensitive national security information. We ask, if it's published, what kind of imminent harm does it do to the United States? If it turns out that it's going to cost somebody's life, or that it's going to blow an ongoing or an imminent intelligence or military operation, well, then there could be a strong case to be made for not publishing it, or at least for delaying its publication. But oftentimes there's no compelling reason. When you dig down deep and you ask government officials, they tell you that some piece of information is simply embarrassing. And to our mind, embarrassment is not a reason not to publish.
Well, David, you'll be surprised, but even I agree that embarrassment's not sufficient. But I know of many cases where publishing secret information, especially about sources and methods of intelligence, has been harmful, even indeed cost Americans lives. And the difficulty is that reporters or their editors are not in a very good position to figure out how harmful such a publication will be, and people in government have a difficult time explaining to them without providing even more information that might even be more damaging.
You're right, Graham. Government officials are probably in a much better position to figure out what is harmful. The reporters are probably in a much better position to figure out what is news. So the fact that we were using drones and the fact that there were a lot of civilian casualties about it was something that government officials certainly would have tried to cover up and did, and something that many reporters were able to tease out as they investigated each and every drone strike. So we often have to ask a lot of questions, and we do a lot of reporting to figure out what would be truly harmful. In the case of Olympic Games, for example, I did what the Times does and what other major news organizations do when they're getting ready to publish significant information, which is you go to the government and you say, okay, please make your case about what harm could be done. And you're right, Graham, you can't really make that case without talking about some classified information. Sometimes they come back and they say, you know, we have no objection if you can simply take out this detail that would lead to a source, or that detail that might blow a future operation. And that's often something you can negotiate. But in the case of Olympic Games, as we discussed, the worm had already gotten out. The world knew that this whole program was out in the open. The Iranians had the code in their hands. There have been many news stories written about the fact that the worm was out there, and the Iranians, of course, had a copy of it.
But what's the national interest here, though? That's the part I still don't understand.
Well, it's a very good question, Esther. And I think the national interest is the very question that President Obama himself asked in the Situation Room. If the United States is using a new weapon, one that some people have said is as powerful as a drone, others have argued could one day be as powerful as a nuclear weapon, then you want to certainly examine the question of whether our using it invites its use against us. It's very much the same kind of question that we used during the nuclear age, when people were asking the question, what are the rules under which we want to use nuclear weapons? And we ended up in that debate in a very different place than we started out. And Graham, as you'll remember, that debate about nuclear weapons took place out in the open. In the time period really between the time the United States dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki through the Cuban Missile Crisis that you wrote about, when of course you had generals who wanted to go use the nuclear weapons to end the Cold War right there in that week.
Well, that's certainly correct. But if you go beyond Stuxnet to your book, Confront and Conceal, you talk about Olympic Games, which is an umbrella, a family of these activities, and give a much bigger picture of what appears to be a concerted campaign. So on the one hand, this is good for the success of a newspaper reporter, even a book, breaking a story. On the other hand, the fact that the Iranians and people in many other countries learn about the vulnerabilities of their system is damage. And so it's hard to think about that balance.
It's a very difficult balance, Graham, and I wouldn't for a moment diminish how hard these decisions are. And it's one of the reasons that you want to go off and have a really serious conversation with government officials about what will do true damage and what won't. And in many cases, you have to say, what will the adversary actually learn or not? Now, in this case, of course, the Iranians already had a copy of the program. The Chinese know the U.S. has this capability. The Russians know it. They've developed a capability of their own. The North Koreans know it. So the people who didn't know it, we came to the conclusion, were actually the American citizens who were helping fund this program and who were at some risk as a result. Now, that then raises the question, is this the kind of thing in which you want to have a public debate? Now, that debate took place in nuclear. It took place about drones. It hasn't happened yet in cyber. And I don't think it will until there are many more developments along these lines.
Well, you and I have debated this issue for many years, and I'm familiar with the claim that says, well, publish secrets, and this will promote reform and public debate. And there's a point, a little bit of a point there. But it's certainly not the blanket get out of jail free card that you or some of your colleagues would like to imagine. So we need to drill down further on this question of when publishing secret sources and methods can be justifiable, if ever, in my view. And that's a topic we need to do a whole separate session on. But as participants now think about their first memo, which we're asking you to write, you need to imagine that you're an advisor to the president, responding to his question about what you would do in this Iranian case, what recommendations you would give to him, given the information that's provided both in the readings and in the case and in these segments that you've heard so far.